The Yellowstone universe is about to take a massive emotional turn, because 1969 might become the most personal Dutton story we have ever seen. After 1944 arrives in 2026, the next chapter in this legendary franchise is expected to be 1969. But this time, the story is not just about land, survival, or building the ranch. This time, it's about legacy. Because by 1969, Spencer Dutton is no longer the young warrior we saw in 1923. He is old, very old. In fact, this is believed to be the year Spencer dies. And yes, that is heartbreaking. But at the same time, it makes the story even more emotional. Because instead of being shocked by a sudden death like we were with Elsa Dutton, we now get to witness the final chapter of a character we already love. We get to see his last moments. We get to see what kind of grandfather he becomes. And most importantly, we get to see his relationship with a very young John Dutton. In 1969, John is only about 10 years old. This means we are finally going to watch his childhood. We will see how he connects with the ranch, how he learns responsibility, how he understands what it truly means to protect his family's land. But the world outside the ranch is changing fast. 1969 was one of the most intense years in American history. The Vietnam War was happening. Protests were growing across the country. Young men were being drafted into war whether they wanted it or not. And here's where things become really interesting for the Dutton story. There is a strong theory that John's father might be drafted into Vietnam, leaving Spencer behind to raise young John himself. Imagine that emotional weight. An old man who has already fought his own battles in life, now raising his grandson while the boy's father is fighting in another war across the world. That kind of real-world pressure can completely shape a child's future. It can turn a young boy into someone strong, serious, and protective. Someone like the man we later meet in Yellowstone. But that's not the only influence in John's life. The late 1960s were also the golden age of rodeo culture. So there is a big chance we might see young John entering that world very early in his life. Learning to ride, learning to compete, learning to become a cowboy not just on the ranch, but in front of crowds, in dangerous competitions, where one mistake can change everything. This is where he might learn courage, confidence, and the fighting spirit that defines the Dutton family. At the same time, another major character from 1923 might return. Elizabeth Strafford. She left the ranch once, but she was pregnant when she did. And now, decades later, she might come back, older, stronger, and ready to fight for her son's rightful claim to the Yellowstone Ranch, which creates the very first real family conflict in Dutton history. Because if her son has a claim to the ranch, then John's inheritance is suddenly in danger. And just like that, the first cracks in the Dutton family begin to appear. The same kind of family tension we later see between Beth and Jamie in Yellowstone might actually begin right here in 1969. This prequel could finally explain how the family started turning against each other, how loyalty became complicated, and how protecting the ranch sometimes meant fighting your own blood. There are even rumors that Matthew McConaughey might join the cast as John's father. A soldier whose sacrifices in Vietnam could shape the future of the entire Dutton legacy. And honestly, that casting choice alone could make this prequel unforgettable. Because at the end of the day, 1969 is not just another Yellowstone story. It's John Dutton's origin story. The story of how a young boy grows up surrounded by war, family conflict, responsibility, and 1969 will be the next Yellowstone prequel after 1944 blesses our screens, and we already have a pretty good idea of what this upcoming story might focus on. And honestly, it's going to be emotional, because this is the year Spencer dies. Yeah, I know. That's not easy to hear. It takes a second for that reality to really sink in. Spencer Dutton has been such a strong and important character in 1923, and imagining a world without him already feels strange. But to be fair, by the time we reach 1969, Spencer would be in his 80s. So realistically, this moment was always going to come eventually. But here's the interesting part. Knowing this important detail before the show even begins might actually make the story more powerful. I know this sounds like an unpopular opinion, but think about it for a moment. Remember how shocked we were when Elsa died in 1883 or Alex in 1923? Their sudden loss completely blindsided us. It was heartbreaking because we didn't see it coming. But there's something even more emotional about watching the final chapter of a character you already love, knowing that their time is almost up. And just because Spencer dies in 1969 doesn't mean he won't be part of the story. In fact, this might be where he matters the most. At this point in the timeline, Spencer would be an old man, possibly acting as a grandfather figure to a very young John Dutton. And if you've watched the original Yellowstone series, you know that there are references to John's grandfather shaping his childhood. So now imagine this: young John spending time with Spencer on the ranch, learning how to ride, learning how to protect the land, learning what it truly means to be a Dutton. Just thinking about those quiet moments between a grandfather and his grandson is enough to make anyone emotional. But this story isn't only about family. 1969 was a massive turning point in American history. The Vietnam War was raging, the civil rights movement was changing the nation, and a new counterculture movement was beginning to rise. Even though the Dutton Ranch is tucked away in Montana, there is no way they would remain untouched by these changes. In fact, one major theory suggests that John's father might be drafted into the Vietnam War. And if that happens, Spencer may be forced to step in and help raise young John himself. These kinds of real-world pressures mixed with ranch life are exactly what could make this prequel feel grounded and realistic. At the same time, the late 1960s were also a golden age for rodeo culture. So picture young John being thrown into that world at an early age, not just learning how to be a cowboy on the ranch, but competing in rodeos, facing challenges, and understanding the bigger Western lifestyle that exists outside Montana. And here's another important detail. In 1969, John Dutton would only be about 10 years old, which means this series will finally give us a front-row seat to his childhood. We'll get to see how he connects with the land, how he interacts with his parents, and who truly shaped him into the man we eventually meet in Yellowstone. This is the first real chance to explore the early generational tensions within the Dutton family. And that's where things get even more complicated. Because Elizabeth Strafford is still alive. She's older now, stronger, and very different from the innocent girl we saw back in 1923. And she might be ready to fight for her son's rightful claim to the ranch, which instantly puts young John's future inheritance into question. This could be the very first crack in Dutton family history, the original fracture that later grows into the kind of conflict we eventually see between Beth and Jamie in Yellowstone. It also helps explain a mystery from the 1923 finale. Remember when Cara never mentioned Elizabeth's pregnancy before she left the ranch? Fans were confused. Was she still pregnant? Did we miss something important? Thankfully, actress Michelle Randolph confirmed that Elizabeth was still pregnant in that scene, which clearly suggests that her child will play a major role in future stories. In fact, Elizabeth is expected to become the key connection between Yellowstone and the upcoming spin-off, The Madison, where we may see her grandchildren return to Montana generations later. As for casting, all eyes are currently on Matthew McConaughey, who is rumored to play John's father in this prequel. A soldier whose sacrifices during the Vietnam War could deeply shape the Dutton legacy. But the biggest casting question still remains: who will play young John Dutton? Because at the end of the day, this is his origin story. And one surprising name that keeps coming up is Isabel May from 1883. Yes, her character Elsa is already dead, but fans would love to see her return in a completely new role as another member of the Dutton family, maybe even as a cousin to John in this next generation. A character who reminds us of Elsa, not exactly the same, but similar in spirit. And honestly, that idea sounds incredible. 1969 will be the next Yellowstone prequel after 1944 blesses our screens in 22/6, and honestly, we already have a very strong idea of what this story might be about. So let's really talk about why this timeline could be one of the most emotional and important chapters in the entire franchise. Because this is the year Spencer dies. Yeah, I know, that's a lot to process. We've followed Spencer's journey for so long that even imagining a timeline without him feels strange. But to be fair, by the time 1969 arrives, he would be in his 80s. So realistically speaking, it makes sense. His time was always going to come eventually. But here's the interesting part. I actually appreciate knowing this information up front. Now, I know that's probably an unpopular opinion, but hear me out for a second. Think back to what happened with Elsa in 1883, or Alex in 1923. Their sudden losses completely blindsided us. We didn't see it coming, and when it happened, it hit like a truck emotionally. It was devastating. But there's also something deeply heart-wrenching about watching the final chapter of a character that you already love. Knowing that Spencer's story is coming to an end in 1969 means every moment we get with him is going to matter even more. And just because Spencer dies in this timeline doesn't mean he won't be a major part of the story. In 1969, he would be in his 80s, which actually lines up perfectly with the grandfather-like figure that gets mentioned in the original Yellowstone series. So just imagine this for a second. The emotional moments between young John Dutton and his grandfather Spencer. I'm not even kidding. Just thinking about those scenes is enough to get emotional. But the family story is only one part of what makes 1969 such an important timeline. Because 1969 was also a massive turning point in American history. The Vietnam War was raging, the civil rights movement was changing the country, and counterculture was starting to rise everywhere. Even though the Duttons are tucked away in Montana, there is no way they would remain completely untouched by these huge social changes happening around them. One theory that actually makes a lot of sense is that John's father could be drafted into Vietnam, leaving Spencer behind to step in and raise him. Now imagine the pressure that would create. A child growing up without his father, a grandfather forced to become a parent again, and a ranch that still needs to survive through all of it. It's these kinds of real-world struggles layered onto ranch life that can make this story feel so grounded and powerful. At the same time, the late 60s were basically a golden era for rodeo culture. So picture a young John being introduced into that world early on, learning what it really means to be a cowboy, not just on the ranch, but through rodeos, competitions, and that larger-than-life Western lifestyle. And here's the best part. In 1969, John Dutton is only about 10 years old, which means through this show, we are basically getting a front-row seat to his childhood. We get to see how he connects with the land, how he interacts with his parents, and most importantly, who really shapes him into the man we eventually meet in Yellowstone. This is the first real opportunity to explore the early generational tensions within the Dutton family. And for me, that's what makes this timeline so powerful, because this is where the first real cracks begin to form in the Dutton legacy. And speaking of family conflict, Elizabeth Strafford from 1923 is still very much alive during this timeline. She's out there, and there's every reason to believe she could return to the Dutton world in 1969. But she won't be the same innocent Elizabeth we saw before. No. She'll be older, stronger, and possibly ready to challenge Spencer's authority for her son's rightful claim to the ranch, which instantly puts young John's inheritance into question. Basically, what we could be watching here is the original fracture in the Dutton family history, the very first internal conflict that later evolves into the kind of rivalry we see between Beth and Jamie generations later. And if the rumors are true, Matthew McConaughey could be stepping into the role of John's father, a soldier shaped by the Vietnam War whose sacrifices would directly impact the future of the Dutton legacy. Another surprising name that keeps coming up is Isabel May from 1883. Yes, we know her character is already gone, but fans continue asking for her return in some new form. And knowing how much Taylor Sheridan loves working with familiar actors, it's definitely not impossible. Some theories even suggest she could return as a cousin to John, a new generation Dutton who strongly resembles Elsa both in personality and appearance. And honestly, that idea sounds pretty amazing. Because at the end of the day, 1969 is not just another prequel, it's John Dutton's origin story.